My boyfriend, in order to chase after his perfect woman, casually tossed me, suffering from unbearable stomach pain, by the side of the highway and let the cold rain lash at my face. Later, when I put on someone else's ring, he pinned me against the wall, gritted his teeth, and asked, "Are you really planning to leave me?" Brianna sat in the passenger seat, her face pale. It was the first day of her period, and her lower abdomen ached painfully, as if it were being twisted and pulled. Joseph was driving and talking on the phone, not noticing her distress. In her dazed state, Brianna heard him mumble a few yes, before he hung up. Joseph, she was about to ask him to stop by a pharmacy to get some painkillers. But the man cut her off with a calm, detached tone. "Brianna, I need to pick someone up. You get out of the car here, and I'll have someone pick you up later." Brianna closed her eyes, gritting her teeth against the pain. She turned to look at him, her voice weak. "This is the highway. You want me to get out here?" Joseph leaned over and kissed her forehead. His tone was gentle but firm. "I have something urgent. Get out here for now. Lambert is on this highway too, and he'll be here in about 10 minutes. You can go back with him then." Brianna looked at her boyfriend. His expression was as gentle as always, but the way his left hand drummed on the steering wheel faster betrayed his impatience. She took a deep breath and softened her tone, her voice tinged with a hint of pleading. "It's the first day of my period, and my stomach really hurts. Besides, you can't stop on the highway." She didn't want to argue with him now. With the way her stomach was cramping, there was no way she could stand for 10 minutes after getting out of the car. Brianna hoped this would soften Joseph's heart, but... "Enough, stop overreacting," Joseph snapped, the softness in his eyes vanishing instantly, replaced by obvious frustration. Without even glancing at her, he pulled over on the emergency lane. The air in the car grew heavy, and Brianna felt like she couldn't breathe. She lowered her eyes and quietly asked him, "Are you going to pick up Lydia?" After a pause, he replied in a neutral tone, clearly uninterested in how she felt. Brianna's hand that was resting on her stomach clenched involuntarily, the tight grip making her fingers tremble until she slowly let go. She knew continuing to press him would be pointless. Pleading when you've already been rejected feels degrading. Before getting out of the car, the last thing she said to him was, "It's ridiculous. My boyfriend leaves me on the side of the highway to pick up another woman." 2 years ago, Brianna had made a mistake in a contract when working as the Party B to negotiate with Party A. On her way back, her high heel got caught in a manhole cover, and she twisted her ankle, unable to pull the shoe out. With traffic buzzing all around her, she didn't want to publicly take off her shoes and walk barefoot. Just as Brianna was about to give in and remove her shoes, a pair of strong, long hands grabbed her ankle, twisted the heel, and pulled the shoe free. From Brianna's perspective, all she could see was the clean, chiseled line of the man's jaw. He released her ankle, stood up, and gave her a playful smile. "How can a girl's feet touch the ground?" The man's handsome face was adorned with a mischievous grin. The sun was blinding, and the air was hot and oppressive, making her irritable. But suddenly, Brianna felt like everything around her had gone silent, silent enough for her to hear only her own heartbeat. In this age of fast food relationships and profit-driven motives, she had fallen in love with him at first sight. The next day, she saw him again in the meeting room and learned he was the project leader from the other company, Joseph. They naturally got together, and sometimes he would say sweet things to her or pick her up from work. The only odd thing was that Joseph never took the initiative to introduce her to his friends. Whenever they met someone he knew, he would only mention her name. But Brianna didn't mind. She liked Joseph, and small details weren't worth fussing over. Brianna first heard Lydia's name on Christmas Eve the year before. Joseph had left work early to pick her up, and they bought some ingredients at the supermarket before heading home. While Brianna was prepping the food in the kitchen, Joseph suddenly hugged her from behind, lightly bit her ear, and laughed softly. "You're so diligent." Brianna jumped in surprise, standing frozen, her face turning bright red. She bit her lip, turned to look at him, her shy eyes tinged with expectation. "Then why haven't you married me yet?" Just as she finished speaking, Brianna felt Joseph's body stiffen for a moment. He didn't speak again. The atmosphere became suddenly cold, and just as she was about to change the subject, Joseph's phone rang. He glanced at the phone, then at Brianna, before walking out to answer it. Brianna, driven by some sixth sense, inexplicably felt that the person on the other end of the line was important to Joseph. On a whim, she quietly stepped out of the kitchen and stood by the wall. She heard Joseph speaking in a tone of unprecedented gentleness. "Why are you suddenly in pain? Is it your period? Did you take any medicine?" After a while, his voice quickened, full of worry and urgency. "I'll come over now and take you to the hospital, okay?" As he said this, he stood up and grabbed his coat, preparing to leave. He turned around, and their eyes met. It was unclear what the person on the other end had said, but after Joseph hung up, he made no further move. A long time passed before the oven's timer brought Brianna back to her senses. "Oh, dinner's ready. You're leaving, right? Well, I'll wait for you to come back and eat." She tried to sound casual, but her tone came out stiff. After speaking, she hurriedly turned and walked away. "Brianna." Brianna stopped, but didn't turn around. He watched her retreating figure for a long time before his deep voice finally broke the silence. "She's just a friend." Later, Brianna would come to understand that this statement was not only directed at her, but also an attempt to convince himself. It turned out that Joseph had grown up with Lydia, had loved her for 8 years, and had been heartbroken when she married someone else. She learned all of this one day when she drunkenly stumbled upon his chat history with Lydia. By then, she had already fallen deeply for Joseph. So, calmly, she put down his phone and took a hot towel from the bathroom to wipe his face. Looking at the man's deep-set eyes, her own eyes filled with tears. She forced a small smile and reassured herself, "It's okay, Lydia is married now. He will love me." But in reality, blind love doesn't always end well. In the 2 years they were together, all her compromises and unconditional tolerance only moved herself, and all that was used up when the news of Lydia's divorce and return to the country came. The wind was strong on the side of the highway, bringing a chill, and with the sky growing darker, a sense of unease rose in Brianna's chest. She had been waiting for nearly half an hour but still hadn't seen Lambert. She had been pressed against the guardrail the entire time, afraid to step forward. The cramping in her stomach was draining what little energy she had left. She took out her phone to call Joseph, but after several attempts to tap the screen with no response, she realized her phone had died. Cars on the highway sped by like arrows, moving incredibly fast. All she could do now was pray that someone would notice her. But misfortune always seems to strike all at once. The overcast sky began to release raindrops intermittently, which soon turned into a torrential downpour. Brianna was drenched by the icy rain, the pain in her lower abdomen growing more unbearable. She could only crouch by the guardrail, clutching her stomach with trembling hands. As dusk approached, an SUV pulled over beside her. A man stepped out with an umbrella, crouched in front of her, and extended it to shield her from the rain. He asked, "Why are you on the highway? Are you alone?" Brianna nodded despite the pain, her voice faint. "Could you help me leave here, or call the police for me?" Without saying much, Matthew scooped up her frail body and half-dragged, half-carried her into the passenger seat. He grabbed a blanket from the back seat and draped it over her before getting back into the driver's seat and starting the car. The heater was turned up to its maximum, and soon Brianna felt warmth returning to her hands and feet. She managed to stop shivering and whispered, "Thank you." Matthew glanced at her pale face. "Should I take you to the hospital?" Brianna barely curved her lips in a weak smile and shook her head. Her voice was hoarse. "No need. Just drop me off somewhere once we're off the highway." Matthew chuckled lightly, finding her response absurd. "You think I'd leave someone who looks like they're about to pass out on the side of the road?" Brianna opened her mouth but couldn't argue. Even if he left her by the roadside, she wouldn't be able to get home. Her phone was dead and possibly water damaged, and she didn't have a penny on her. Matthew didn't give her more time to hesitate. "Tell me your address." Brianna remained silent. The only place she had here was the apartment she shared with Joseph, but she didn't want to return there. The rain had left her feeling utterly chilled. Seeing her reluctance, Matthew found it amusing. "What's with the wariness?" Brianna coughed anxiously and shook her head. No, it's not that." "I'll trouble you, then." She gave him the address of an apartment a friend had asked her to look after recently. The friend had gone abroad for further studies, leaving the apartment vacant and entrusting the keys to Brianna. At least she had a place to go, thanks to the key in her bag. Matthew raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. When they passed a pharmacy, Matthew abruptly braked and stopped the car. He opened the door, glanced at her, and said, "Wait here." Brianna nodded. "Okay." Watching his tall, upright figure disappear into the rain, she blinked, wondering if he had gone to buy her medicine. A few minutes later, Matthew returned and tossed a bag onto her lap. "What's this?" Brianna looked at the bag, then at him. "Cold medicine." Brianna pursed her lips. "Thank you, but I don't think I have a." Before she could finish, an itch in her nose made her sneeze. She hadn't expected to be proven wrong so quickly. Matthew shot her a knowing glance. Before restarting the car, Brianna hesitated and spoke again. "Could you?" Matthew paused. "What is it?" "Could you wait a moment? I want to buy some more medicine." Matthew frowned. "What else do you need?" "What's wrong?" "I'll go get it." As he was about to get out again, Brianna quickly stopped him. "No, I'll go myself." Matthew stared at her for a few seconds, making her feel a bit uneasy. Then, gesturing to the pouring rain outside, he said, "See how heavy the rain is? If you go out again, I might as well drop you off at the hospital directly." His words carried a sharp irony. The relentless rain outside and the awkward silence inside the car only heightened the tension. After a moment of internal conflict, Brianna reluctantly gave him the names of 2 medications. Matthew repeated them for confirmation before getting out with his umbrella. The pharmacist handed him the medications and joked, "Buying these for your girlfriend? Remember, girls shouldn't touch cold water during their period." Matthew paused briefly, nodded, and said nothing. Returning to the car, he handed the medicine to Brianna, his expression unchanged. The rest of the drive passed in silence. "Which building and floor?" Matthew finally broke the silence after the medicine episode. Brianna thought for a moment. "Building 3, Unit 1. Matthew chuckled again. Brianna turned to him, puzzled. "Why are you laughing?" As they reached the parking lot, she asked, "Why did you park here?" Matthew turned off the engine, got out, and opened the passenger door. Looking down at her, he said meaningfully, "I live here too." Brianna followed him in a daze to the elevator. She pressed the button for her floor, but Matthew didn't make a move. Brianna swallowed nervously. This couldn't be a coincidence, right? When the elevator stopped, they stepped out together. There were only 2 units on the floor. She watched in disbelief as Matthew unlocked the door to the apartment next to hers. Before entering, he turned and casually reminded her, "Don't drink cold stuff these days." His tone was nonchalant, unlike her awkward embarrassment. Brianna's fragile mental state finally crumbled. Exhausted, she took a shower, drank her medicine, and buried herself in bed, falling into a deep sleep. At the airport exit, Lydia finally appeared after nearly an hour of waiting due to a flight delay. She looked radiant and poised, showing no signs of her past marriage, just as dazzling as 3 years ago. "Joseph." She curved her lips into a seductive smile. "Lydia, long time no see," Joseph said, his voice deep and hoarse. Hearing his formal greeting, Lydia paused, then smiled. "Why so distant?" Joseph responded with a faint, unreadable smile and took her suitcase. "Where to?" Lydia rubbed her stomach and frowned lightly. "I'm starving." She pouted at him like she used to, as if nothing had changed between them. Joseph felt a flicker of nostalgia, his tone softening unconsciously. "Let's get you something to eat first." Lydia's eyes lit up. "Let's go to the restaurant we used to frequent." While driving, Lydia, bored, turned on the car radio. A female announcer reported, at 2:37 p.m. today, a section of the XX highway collapsed due to heavy rain. The number of casualties is currently being confirmed. Joseph's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He turned off the radio and called Lambert. "What's up? Where are you?" "I just got home." Joseph's frown deepened. "Did you see the text I sent asking you to pick up Brianna?" "What text?" Lambert suddenly became alert. "I didn't see it. I was driving." "Where is she? Do you still need me to pick her up?" Joseph immediately hung up and tried calling Brianna, but her phone remained off. After several attempts, he gave up. Lydia noticed his dark expression mixed with a trace of worry. Confused, she asked, "What's wrong?" Her clear voice brought him back. Exhaling softly, he said, "Nothing." But he didn't call Brianna again. He told himself such a low-probability event wouldn't happen. Brianna was probably just throwing a tantrum and ignoring him. Still, he didn't contact her for the next few days. Brianna stayed at the apartment and avoided anything related to Joseph. Since she only went out for work, she didn't run into Matthew again. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. That day, though it was supposed to be her day off, her boss realized during a contract signing that he'd forgotten the documents. Brianna was told to deliver them within half an hour. The situation happened so suddenly. After rushing to deliver the contract and hurrying back home, Brianna stood at her door only to realize she had forgotten her keys. She stared silently at the polished, dark wooden door for a while, then turned with a hopeful thought and knocked on Matthew's door. A few seconds later, the door opened, revealing Matthew in casual attire. Brianna felt a little awkward. "I forgot my keys. Can I borrow your balcony for a moment?" Matthew gave a casual nod and stepped aside to let her in. "Thanks," Brianna said, following him to the balcony. She glanced briefly around his apartment. It was almost twice the size of hers. He seemed to live alone, but the space was tidy, with a simple and tasteful decor. Matthew leaned lazily against the balcony railing and gave her a once-over. "You're planning to climb across?" Brianna nodded. "Yes, the balconies are really close. It's not that hard." The man chuckled lightly, scratching his eyebrow. "Don't be so confident. We're on the 15th floor." Feeling a bit irked at being underestimated, Brianna explained earnestly, "I used to climb trees all the time as a kid." Matthew smirked and didn't waste more time debating. He glanced at the balcony, braced himself on the railing, and with a swift movement, flipped over to the other side. Brianna stood dumbfounded at the edge of the balcony, finally realizing just how far apart the two balconies were. He jumped over so effortlessly. "What are you waiting for?" "The door's open," Matthew said, already back inside her apartment. She didn't even notice when he had returned. Brianna swallowed and, with genuine admiration, said, "You're amazing." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "You flatter me." Later, on her way home from work, Brianna ran into Matthew again. She ended up catching a ride with him, and gradually, they began to cross paths more often. During one of their conversations, Matthew mentioned that he was a retired Special Forces soldier and now worked as a trainer for the military. It turned out that his base was in the same direction as her workplace. One day, Matthew casually suggested he could give her a ride to work, and if time permitted, they could return together in the evenings. Brianna initially gave a polite refusal, but quickly accepted the offer, agreeing to treat him to a meal in return. Matthew didn't seem to mind either way. When Joseph's name appeared on her phone screen, Brianna paused. It had been half a month since they last spoke, and she realized she hadn't even thought about him during that time. Some things needed to be addressed. She hesitated before answering the call. "Brianna? What do you want?" His usually deep and magnetic voice sounded dark and accusatory. "Have you been having too much fun outside to come home?" His tone was unmistakably questioning. Her mind snapped back to clarity like cold water pouring over her. For a fleeting moment, upon hearing his familiar voice, she'd foolishly allowed herself a sliver of misplaced hope. She inwardly cursed herself as a fool and then found him utterly ridiculous. "I thought you'd already brought Lydia home. Wasn't I supposed to make room for her?" At the mention of Lydia, Joseph's tone softened slightly as he recalled the incident on the highway. "She and I are just friends now. What happened last time was a misunderstanding." When Brianna didn't respond, he continued, "I sent Lambert a text, but he didn't see it." How absurd. He could have called Lambert directly, but instead, he sent a half-hearted text and didn't follow up. Clearly, he never gave it much thought. Brianna lowered her gaze to the blanket on her lap. The gentle moonlight spilled onto it, reminding her of the time long ago when Lydia had felt unwell during her period. Joseph had abandoned Brianna on Christmas Eve to be with Lydia. That night's moon was just like tonight's. She'd sat on the sofa, waiting all night, but he never returned. Love and indifference, it was always so obvious. In truth, her one-sided persistence had lost its meaning long ago. She couldn't entirely blame Joseph. After all, she was the one who clung to him, despite knowing he loved someone else. She was reaping what she had sown. "Brianna?" His voice called her name again after her prolonged silence, bringing her back to the present. A light breeze slipped through the window, gently waking her. Brianna looked at the green plant in the corner. It was arranged beautifully, but placed where it couldn't get sunlight. Its edges were already starting to turn yellow. No matter how beautiful something was, if it wasn't suitable, it was pointless. So she said, "Let's break up, Joseph." The line went quiet, so still it seemed even his breathing stopped for a moment. After a few seconds, he slowly asked, "You want to break up with me?" His voice carried a restrained emotion. Brianna stayed silent, confirming his suspicion. Joseph let out a bitter laugh, his words cutting. "You've known about Lydia and me all along. Why hold on for so long if you couldn't endure it?" His words struck a sharp pain in her chest, finally jolting her into complete clarity. There it was. He had watched her love him unconditionally, knowing everything, yet he carelessly trampled her heart. Joseph instantly regretted his words. He pinched the bridge of his nose, his tone softening. "Listen to me." Before he could finish, Brianna cut him off. Her voice was firm, trembling with suppressed tears. "You're right. This is my fault. But can't I stop now?" Then, her tone grew quieter, a hint of a sob breaking through. "I've never wronged you. Why do you have to treat me like this?" For the first time, panic surged in Joseph's chest, as if something had slipped through his grasp, like a kite with its string cut, never to return. When he finally tried to speak again, Brianna had already hung up. After ending the call, she sent him a text, "I'll come by at 5 p.m. on Friday to pack my things. I hope you won't be there." Then she decisively blocked him. Brianna wrapped herself in her blanket and told herself, "You'd be an idiot to still care about a jerk like him." In the 2 years she'd been with Joseph, she'd never shown him any vulnerability. Even when she first learned about Lydia, though she'd looked like she was about to cry, she pretended to be unaffected. This was the first time she allowed herself to feel this heartbroken. Joseph closed his eyes, slumping against the sofa, a suffocating pain gripping his chest. He exhaled heavily, thinking, "She's serious." So serious it terrified him. On Friday morning, Matthew waited for her at the parking lot as usual. A few minutes later, Brianna stepped out of the elevator and into his car. She handed him a small box. Matthew took it and asked, "What's this?" "I made sandwiches this morning. I had an extra, so it's for you." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Thanks." The sandwich didn't have much of a smell, and the two ate quietly in the car before driving off. On the way, Brianna suddenly remembered something and turned to him. "You don't have to wait for me tonight. I'm going apartment hunting." She wasn't lying. Staying at a friend's place for too long wasn't ideal. Matthew paused briefly but remained expressionless. "You're moving out?" Brianna nodded. "It's my friend's place. I'm just staying temporarily." He didn't say much else, but when they arrived at her office, he said casually, "Tell me your requirements for an apartment. I'll help you keep an eye out." Resting one hand on the steering wheel, his tone was nonchalant. Brianna smiled. "Thanks. I don't have many requirements. As long as it's clean and not too expensive, I'm good. Would you consider sharing?" She thought for a moment. "I wouldn't mind, as long as the roommate's clean and quiet." Matthew gave a slow nod, his tone unreadable. "Got it." For some reason, Brianna felt a vague sense of foreboding. That afternoon, Brianna finished her work early and left the office around 4:30 p.m., carrying her bag. When she opened the door to her old apartment, she saw Joseph sitting on the sofa, waiting for her, unexpected, yet somehow inevitable. Brianna ignored him and walked straight back to her room to pack her things. "Are you done acting like this? Brianna, have I spoiled you too much?" He stood up and grabbed her wrist. Brianna suddenly remembered how he'd called her spoiled when he threw her out on the roadside that day. She had probably moved on, and the sadness she felt when hearing those words had already faded. Now, she mostly felt annoyance and amusement. It was as if the heartbreak was something from a long time ago. She pulled her wrist free, packed her things, picked up her suitcase, and turned to look at him. She smiled faintly, but there was no emotion behind it. "You're right. I've been throwing tantrums, now I'm leaving. I won't be around to throw tantrums in front of you anymore. Can you please step aside?" The woman before him was still delicate and beautiful, but there was no longer any love in her eyes when she looked at him. Joseph pressed his lips together and stared at her with cold eyes, blocking her path and not moving an inch. She had no patience to deal with him, so she sidestepped and squeezed out. When she reached the foyer, his voice came from behind, low and cold. "I'll say it one last time, if you leave now, don't come back." The last trace of heaviness in her heart lifted, and Brianna chuckled lightly. "I couldn't care less." She tossed the keys onto the shoe cabinet and turned to leave, looking incredibly carefree. Joseph stared at the keys on the cabinet, his discomfort and panic barely suppressed. He told himself she would come back, she loved him so much, how could she just leave? Brianna was furious. When she got home, she realized she had forgotten to check out the apartment. With a deep sigh, she thought to herself, what a jerk. She glanced at the time, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and decided to check out the apartment tomorrow instead. The unpleasantness from Joseph lingered in her mind, affecting her mood. Brianna didn't feel like cooking, so she grabbed a cup of instant noodles, poured in some hot water, and let it sit while she prepared to eat. Just then, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Matthew standing there. "Is something up?" Brianna leaned her head out to look at him. Matthew raised an eyebrow and glanced at her body hidden behind the door. "Can't I come in?" Brianna opened the door wider. "No, come on in." He looked at the lonely bowl of noodles on the table and frowned slightly. "Is this what you're eating tonight?" Brianna chuckled awkwardly. "I'm not hungry tonight." Then she quickly changed the subject. "Did you need something? Have you found a place to live?" Matthew asked. Brianna lowered her eyes and shook her head. Just thinking about apartments reminded her of Joseph. Matthew watched the lively girl in front of him and couldn't help but compare her to the girl he'd found in the pouring rain half a month ago. Back then, she was like a little bird drenched in the rain, pitiful and helpless, unable to fly. Though she was young, she always tried to act much older than she was. And yet, it wasn't convincing. It was almost adorable, like a child wearing adult clothes. "Do you want to move in with me?" The quiet air suddenly shattered with his unexpected question. Brianna paused in her flip-flops, then looked up at him, blinking. "What did you say? Not willing?" Brianna instinctively denied it. No, that's not it." She couldn't put her finger on why it felt off, her mind was a little scrambled. Matthew slowly listed the benefits of living with him. "My rent's not high, the place is clean, I don't talk too much, and the best part is, you can carpool to work with me." She found it hard to argue against any of it. After a moment of silence, Brianna finally asked, "You live alone and seem to be doing just fine. Why do you want to share a place? You don't seem to need the money." Matthew looked away from the cold noodles on the table and met her gaze, his eyes calm. "What do you want me to say?" His features were sharp, likely due to his military background. Even in casual clothes, his posture exuded a quiet sense of pressure. Brianna felt unsettled under his intense gaze, unsure how to respond. She could only laugh awkwardly and brush it off. "Nothing, never mind." Matthew noticed her discomfort but continued to move closer. Brianna's heart raced. She tried to keep calm, but her eyes kept darting around, unable to meet his. "Are you going to say that I like you? That I don't want you to leave, so I'm asking you to move in with me?" Matthew slipped his hands into his pockets, backing her up against the wall, his gaze locked on her eyes. Her face flushed, and instead of shyness, it seemed more like awkwardness. Brianna composed herself, though her cheeks were still red. She answered him seriously, "Sorry, I just got out of a relationship. I'm probably not ready for a new one right now." Matthew laughed softly. She was clearly rejecting him, but she looked so cute doing it. He stood up straight and stepped back to give her space, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. "All right, how about giving me a chance? What if you move out and I show you how I can be?" With such good conditions, anyone who turned this down would be a fool. Besides, she needed to move on. She had turned down enough people in the past 2 years, for Joseph's sake. Matthew saw that Brianna was thinking it over, then nodded when she finally agreed, loosening his hands from his pockets. He pointed to the noodles she'd made. "That's cold now. I just made some food. Want to eat together?" Brianna shook her head. No, I'll make another bowl. She couldn't just reject someone and then go eat at their place. Matthew didn't push further. He knew that forcing things would only backfire. Instead, he brought over a few dishes he'd prepared and then left. That was the first time Brianna had seen Joseph look so panicked. Before leaving work, Matthew had sent her a text saying he'd be able to pick her up, asking her to wait. Brianna decided to tease him and only replied with an okay, without the usual playful stickers. A few minutes later, he replied, "Won't keep you waiting too long." He really thought she was upset, and Brianna couldn't help but smile mischievously. Ever since Matthew confessed, he'd been pursuing her seriously and patiently for 3 months. When he first found her, it had been the last rain of autumn, and now the coldest part of the year was almost over. Though they lived under the same roof, Matthew had never made a move on her. He respected her space, keeping an appropriate distance, and was genuinely trying to win her heart. 3 months wasn't long, but Brianna still hadn't fallen for Matthew. However, she had completely let go of Joseph. Her company had ongoing business with Joseph's, and 2 months ago, when she went there for a handover, she had seen Joseph with Lydia coming out of the elevator. She stood far away, and they didn't notice her. She overheard people talking about how well-matched Joseph and Lydia were, and she didn't feel much about it, even agreeing with them. A few seconds later, she continued looking through the contract in her hands, no longer distracted. Less than 10 minutes later, Matthew arrived. After getting his call, Brianna walked downstairs. The tall, slender man was leaning against the car, silently watching her. The cool breeze lifted the hem of his coat, and for a moment, she felt a flicker of attraction. Brianna walked quickly toward him, looking up with a smile. "Let's go." Matthew nodded. Just as she turned around, her arm was suddenly pulled back with force. She looked back to see Joseph staring at her with a dark look in his eyes. His voice was chilling. "Brianna, it's only been a short while, and you're already with someone else?" He shot a glance at the man beside her, his hostility clear. Joseph had been blocked on all platforms by Brianna, and just when he tried to salvage their relationship, a work crisis demanded his full attention. While dealing with the chaos, Lydia approached him, and for a while, he genuinely attempted to move on from Brianna and open his heart to someone new. Brianna was still his first love, but his feelings had already changed. Lydia clung to him, holding his hand and hugging him daily, mirroring the way Brianna used to. At times, even her figure while cooking resembled Brianna's. One fateful day, on a whim he couldn't explain, Joseph let Lydia stay over. When night fell, words became unnecessary between two adults. Lydia shyly lay beneath him, her beauty tinged with desire. As he kissed her, it was as though he was cherishing a long-coveted treasure. But just as he was about to lose control, he suddenly turned over and lay on his back, covering his eyes with his arm. "I'm sorry," he said. "I can't forget her." Even though he repeatedly told himself that he loved Lydia and that Brianna was no longer important, he couldn't deny the truth. Life without Brianna felt hollow, like wandering through a soulless existence. It was then he finally admitted to himself, he had fallen for Brianna a long time ago. He resolved to swallow his pride and reconcile with her, as long as she could forgive him. On the way to see her, he spotted a flower shop and remembered her love for white camellias. Without hesitation, he bought a bouquet. But now, he couldn't bring himself to give her the flowers. Joseph's heart ached as though pierced by countless needles. How could she laugh and chat with another man as if nothing had happened in just a few short months? Matthew noticed Joseph grabbing Brianna's wrist and swatted his hand away without hesitation. His gaze was firm as he said, "If you have something to say, say it. No need to get physical." Joseph's anger flared instantly. His voice was sharp as he retorted, "I'm talking to her. This has nothing to do with you." Brianna's expression shifted from surprise to indifference. She stepped in front of Matthew, her gaze calm as she looked at Joseph, almost wondering how she ever liked him in the first place. "Do you still not understand why I broke up with you?" she interrupted him. Joseph's bloodshot eyes locked onto her. The sudden drop in temperature that night made her words even colder. "It's because when I told you I wasn't feeling well, you left me alone on the highway. It's because your heart was never certain, yet you stayed with me anyway. It's because the person you've always loved was someone else, Joseph." Joseph's eyes grew misty. Trembling, he reached out to her, his voice hoarse. "I was wrong. Can you forgive me, just this once? Brianna stepped aside, avoiding his touch. Would he ever truly panic for her? It didn't matter anymore. I'm not holding grudges against you. But you don't know, she said with a faint laugh, as though mocking her past self. That day, I don't even know how long I stood in the rain. I wanted to call you, to tell you how much pain I was in, but my phone had died. So I could only squat by the roadside, alone. Her voice was steady, as if recounting someone else's story, the pain no longer hers. For 2 years, I forgave you many times. Their encounter ended with Joseph walking away, utterly dejected. After he left, Brianna decisively got into a car, her rearview mirror reflecting his retreating figure. She didn't look back even once. 2 months later, the harsh winds of autumn and the winter snow gave way to the warmth of spring. One evening in late March, Brianna suffered from acute gastroenteritis caused by long work hours and an irregular schedule. What seemed like a minor inflammation was agonizingly painful. Matthew noticed something was wrong and immediately took her to the hospital for treatment. When Brianna woke up in the early hours, she saw Matthew slouched in a chair by her side, his shirt slightly wrinkled, fighting off sleep. He had taken off his coat and draped it over her. When Matthew noticed she was awake, he squatted in front of her and spoke in a hoarse voice. Does it still hurt? He glanced at the drip and sighed in relief. There's still some left. Brianna looked down at him, her nose stinging with emotion. She gently rubbed his earlobe and asked, "Would you be my boyfriend?" She added softly in her heart, "I'm sorry I didn't fall for you at first sight. But thank you for staying with me these past months, helping me move on from my last relationship. Because of your genuine love and care, I've come to believe that I, too, deserve to be loved." That spring, Brianna finally found someone who loved her wholeheartedly and responded to her every need. 3 months into their relationship, during a nighttime stroll, Matthew pulled her into a jewelry store and stopped at the ring display counter. Brianna tugged his hand nervously. "Isn't this a bit too fast?" Matthew raised an eyebrow and chuckled. "What are you thinking? He simply bought a pair of ordinary rings, claiming his territory as her boyfriend." Then he squinted playfully at her and teased, "Did you think these were engagement rings?" Brianna blushed, flustered by his accurate guess. "Of course not." After walking for a while, Brianna grew tired. While Matthew went to buy her milk tea, she lifted her hand to admire the ring. A smile crept onto her face. It was just an ordinary ring, but she couldn't help loving it. Suddenly, she was pushed against a wall by someone's forceful grip. Frowning, Brianna looked up to see Joseph. It had been about half a year since she last saw him, and he hadn't contacted her since then. Joseph's eyes were fixed on the ring on her hand, his voice laced with bitterness. "So you really don't want me anymore?" At that moment, the realization hit him, Brianna was truly gone, and she had fallen for someone else. His heart ached as if it were being torn apart. "I've cut all ties with Lydia," he pleaded desperately. "I only want you now. Let's get married, Brianna. Don't leave me." Gone was the prideful man she once knew, all that remained was his most humble plea. Yet, it did nothing to sway her. She gently pushed his hand away and said softly, "You were the one who let me go first. The day you left me, you made your choice." Joseph froze, unable to lift his hand to stop her again. Brianna didn't dwell, sidestepping him and walking away. Joseph turned slightly to watch her retreating figure. She looked just as she had before, unchanged. The ring on her hand caught the streetlight and gleamed, its brightness piercing his eyes. Joseph suddenly remembered a day during their 2-year relationship when he had paused in front of a jewelry store. A couple stood by the counter, selecting rings, the man doting, the woman radiant. At that moment, Brianna's image flashed through his mind, and he had walked toward the counter as if possessed. Just as he was about to ask about a pair of rings, Lydia had called, saying she was getting a divorce. That day, Joseph left the jewelry store in long strides and never looked back. Epilogue. Brianna was chewing on the straw of her drink, occasionally sneaking glances at the man driving. When she came back earlier, Matthew was already there, waiting for her in the same spot. She was about to explain, but he simply handed her the drink with a quiet expression before heading off to the parking lot to drive. Brianna took another sip, deliberately trying to start a conversation. "I clearly asked for a hot one, but this one's lukewarm." She shook the drink in her hand towards him. Matthew didn't even glance her way, merely responding indifferently, "Is that so?" "Yes, yes." "Don't believe me? Taste it for yourself." She moved the drink closer toward him. Matthew tilted his head to avoid it. "I believe you." Seeing him dodge the drink, Brianna glared at him. "Why are you avoiding me? Are you disgusted by me?" Matthew gave a faint smile, but didn't answer. Brianna felt a little upset and decided not to speak anymore. They remained in silence until they entered the elevator in their neighborhood. The more Brianna thought about it, the angrier she got. Usually, he wouldn't even let her go, always kissing her nonstop, and now he was acting like he was disgusted by her. She opened the door and headed straight for her room, not even looking at him. But before she could turn on the lights, she was suddenly lifted and placed on the cabinet by the entrance. Then came Matthew's fierce, forceful kiss,